I'm Slava Tsilba. Welcome to Conversations with Slava. Today I'm talking to Professor Alena Douhan. Professor, how do you define human rights when undertaking your work as Special Rapporteur on the negative impact of unilateral coercive measures on the enjoyment of human rights?
Good afternoon, Mr. Zilber. My mandate as a Special Rapporteur is one of the thematic mandates which are established by the Human Rights Council. And usually thematic mandates are focusing on a specific human rights or a couple of very conjunctive human rights. But when we speak about my mandate is seeking to assess the impact of unilateral sanctions on all categories of human rights. And we're speaking about both political, economic, civil, cultural, social rights, including the right to development. And as a result, there is a need to analyze every specific category of human rights, as well as the human rights of specific categories of population when doing the work as a mandate holder.
What is the right to development?
Well, when we speak about the right to development, that's one of the rights which is so-called a collective right, one of the latest generations of human rights, which basically constitutes an integral part of the sustainable development concept. Every people, every group of people has a right to develop itself, to achieve common goods, and to guarantee that every person in the society will be able to enjoy the whole scope of human rights, including, for example, such rights as the right to the highest attainable standard of living, the protection of environment, economic and social guarantees as well, and naturally the eradication of poverty, lowering of mortality rates for the whole society. That's why this right stays a little bit separate to the traditional 5 groups of human rights and is understood as a human rights. And by the way, the United Nations is paying now lots of attention to the point there is a special rapporteur on the right to development dealing with these problems separately, and a number of expert groups as well.
Could you please explain how unilateral coercive measures or sanctions function? What would happen if a US citizen or German citizen or company violated US sanctions on Syria or Venezuela?
Well, when we speak about the impact of unilateral coercive measures on human rights, we need to take into account that there are different types of unilateral coercive measures. There are, for example, measures which are so-called sectoral sanctions, which are usually imposed to the whole sector of economy of the targeted country. Here we can speak, for example, about the oil sector in Venezuela or in Syria or in some other states, mining sectors, as for example in Russian Federation, or mining sector in Venezuela, banking sector in Iran, and so forth. Another group of unilateral sanctions are so-called targeted sanctions. And usually when they are imposed, they announce that they seek to target people who are presumably doing something bad to prevent them from doing this sort of activity. Also, generally speaking, the list of unilateral targeted sanctions today is really enormous if one looks at the list of targeted sanctions imposed, for example, by the United States. That's more than 1,500 pages long, the list itself. Therefore, when we speak about the impact on human rights, it's necessary to admit that naturally sectoral sanctions, which affect the whole sectors of economy, have the most devastating impact. So people are losing their jobs. The specific sectors of economy, as well as the enterprises, are not able to function normally anymore. They do not get any income. The state itself is not getting any income, and that means that it can't pay social benefits, not only salaries for public workers, but also social benefits like medicine or education or rent or any other benefits. Moreover, traditionally, in this situation, we start to face the situation of overcompliance. And here I start to mention the so-called targeted secondary sanctions, referring to your question. So the companies which trade with the targeted individuals or targeted companies, or which violate the sectoral sanctions regime, even if they are placed in the United States or the European Union or in any other part of the world, may also be listed for violation of this regime. So that's a regime of secondary sanctions. And if one looks, for example, at the United States documents, the civil liability may be up to $250,000 and the criminal liability up to more than $1 million. And there could also be custody sentence up to 15 or even 20 years in custody. So therefore, usually people and companies prefer not to risk, even if the individual or the company they used to trade with are not in the lists yet. Therefore, they usually stop any trade operations. And here I speak not only about the direct trade agreements, for example, function of banking system. So banks decide not to do any money transfers or to freeze the assets of people from a specific country, being scared of the possible listing or being scared of that people they trade with or bank transfers of which they provide may be listed at a certain point. It has been said by some non-government organization to me that in practice, and I agree with that observation, that quite often the fear of sanctions targets even more than the sanctions themselves, because the fear of sanctions target the whole population as such. Again, when we speak about these sanctions, I need to mention that unilateral sanctions in the existing forms and in the face of the enormous overcompliance, they affect all categories of human rights. And I could, for example, speak a lot about the impact of sanctions in the course of the pandemic. Despite of the repeated statements and calls from the side of the from my side, from the side of the UN Secretary General, from the side of the UN High Commission on Human Rights, from the side of the Pope, to lift or at least suspend sanctions in the course of the pandemic to provide the targeted society the ability to face the emergency, it hasn't been done. And as a result, in practice, there are enormous problems to buy medicine or medical goods or protective kits. The transportation companies refuse to deliver any goods to the targeted societies. Partner companies, as well as donors of humanitarian aid, prefer not to be involved directly into delivery of these humanitarian aid and humanitarian goods. If states or companies have their money frozen, they can't use them even for buying essential goods. And I speak about the food, medicine, as well as other aspects of humanitarian need. Moreover, enormous problem comes to things which are usually not to be considered as enormously essential goods. And I speak about the equipment and spare parts. If you do not repair spare parts of whatever industry, for example, the food industry, it starts to be destroyed at a certain point. And that means that the possibility of the country to provide people with food or with medicine or with anything else is basically much worse than it could be. And naturally, if a country starts to get less money than it used to get before, it starts to focus on the pure survival of the population. I will cite here the example of Venezuela, that when the population, due to the enormous inflation and the impact of unilateral sanctions, became enormously dependent on the social payments and social assistance from the side of the government. And I'm not speaking about providing money for the population only. I'm speaking about providing food baskets because people have nothing to do, nothing to eat. And they're enormously dependent on any medical aid provided by the government as well. So therefore, when government starts to focus on the pure survival of the population, naturally it stops all developmental programs. No houses are usually built in this situation. Reconstruction processes do not take place. Any educational processes stop and so forth. So as a result, all categories of human rights are affected and the right to development is impeded a lot as well.
If the person or the company violating the sanctions is not on US soil and is not a US citizen or registered in the United States, is there a way to get to that person or the company nonetheless for the violation, to punish that person for a violation?
Yes, indeed. In this situation, it won't usually come to the situation of criminal charge from the side of the United States, usually, or of any other sanctioned country. At the same time, it's possible to list this person and to impose certain limitations, for example, the travel bans or visa bans, or to freeze the assets. And freezing assets are most important for trade, because usually if you look at the financial and banking system of the contemporary society, no bank is functioning alone. All of them are interacting via IBAN, all the payments go to SWIFT. We are to provide this very similar information, and all banks have correspondent banks somewhere, quite often in the United States or in the European Union or in any other states. And to do a payment, banks which have correspondent banks in the countries which impose sanctions would prefer to freeze assets or to prevent any transaction of taking place. Quite often, some of these companies are still able to do the transactions and able to buy the goods, but it usually takes place via several agents and via several banks, and as a result, they are supposed to pay much more. And the price of the goods is increasing. I have been reported, for example, that in some countries it comes to the 2-3 times increase in price of the basic goods.